Imagine this scene for a moment. It's a warm summer afternoon on July 16th, 1054. Inside the massive Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, everything is being prepared for the divine liturgy. The church is calm, sacred, and filled with expectation. And then, something shocking happens. Three men dressed as Western clergy walk straight onto the sanctuary. They're not there to pray. Leading them is Cardinal Humbert of Silva, Canada, a man known for being blunt and unapologetic. Without hesitation, they approach the high altar and place a document on it. It was a formal declaration excommunicating Patriarch Michael Cyrillarius and his followers. After doing this, Humbert turns around, walks out of the church, shakes the dust off his feet, and says, "Let God look and judge." According to tradition, a deacon even chased after them, begging them to take the document back. But it was dropped in the street and left there. A few days later, the Patriarch fired back by excommunicating the Western legates in return. At the time, many people probably thought this was just another church argument, but it wasn't. That moment became the symbol of something far bigger. This was the Great Schism. The point when Christianity split into two worlds, the Latin West, what would become the Roman Catholic Church, and the Greek East, the Eastern Orthodox Church. And here's the real question. Was this breakup really about a few theological disagreements? Or was something deeper going on? To really understand why the Christian world fractured, you have to look past the drama at Hagia Sophia. For centuries, cultural differences, political rivalries, language barriers, and growing mistrust had quietly been driving East and West apart. By 1054, all that tension finally boiled over. By the 11th century, Christianity was no longer a single, unified world. It had evolved into two very different civilizations. In the early days of the Apostles, the Roman Empire had been tightly connected. Educated people often spoke both Greek and Latin, and ideas flowed freely between East and West. But that unity didn't last. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476, everything began to change. Language was one of the first casualties. By around 450, hardly anyone in Western Europe could read Greek. By the year 600, it was just as rare for someone in the Byzantine East to speak Latin. Even Patriarch Photius, one of the greatest scholars of the 9th century, couldn't read Latin at all. And to make matters worse, Emperor Michael III reportedly brushed Latin off as a barbarian and Scythic tongue. That language gap did real damage. When you can't speak the same language, you lose shared meaning. Conversations became awkward, ideas were misunderstood, and subtle points were lost in translation. Over time, suspicion filled the silence left behind. The two sides also started thinking very differently. In the Latin West, theology was shaped by Roman law and order. Faith was often explained in practical, legal terms. The relationship between God and humanity was seen through ideas like authority, merit, guilt, and judgment. Salvation became something discussed almost like a legal case. What was owed, what was paid, and who had the authority to decide. The Greek East went in a completely different direction. Still deeply influenced by Greek philosophy, Eastern Christians viewed theology as something mystical and lived, not just analyzed. To them, faith could not be divided into worship, prayer, and divine liturgy. The East, rather than basing its attention on legal redemption, focused on theosis. It was the thought that man is transformed and made one with God through sharing his uncreated energies. Both sides believed they were faithfully carrying on the teachings of the apostles, but they weren't reading the same books anymore. They weren't using the same sources, and they weren't even asking the same questions. And that led to stereotypes. The Byzantines began to see Western Christians as uneducated and crude. The Latins, in return, viewed the Greeks as overly picky, impractical, and even weak. And by the time we reached 1054, things were already hanging by a thread. The relationship between East and West was brittle. All it needed was one strong push to finally snap. And that push came from a mix of politics, pride, and a few very heated church arguments. The immediate spark was actually political. In southern Italy, a fierce group called the Normans was taking over territory that belonged to both the Byzantine Empire and the papacy. Pope Leo IX was in trouble and needed help fast. His plan was to team up with the Byzantine Emperor, Constantine IX, to push the Normans back. Sounds reasonable, right? But there was a problem. Patriarch Michael Cerularius in Constantinople deeply mistrusted the West. He didn't like Western customs, and he certainly didn't like the Pope's growing claims of authority over the entire Christian world. So instead of smoothing things over, Cerularius did the opposite. He shut down Latin Rite churches in Constantinople and openly attacked Western practices. That's when the arguments really came to the surface. One of the biggest fights was over something that might sound small today: bread. The West used unleavened bread in the Eucharist, while the East used leavened bread. The Greeks accused the Latins of introducing a Jewish practice and abandoning what they believed was the original apostolic tradition. To them, this symbolized how far the West had drifted. Then there was the famous Filioque Controversy. The West had added the phrase, "and from the Son," to the Nicene Creed, originally to combat heresy in Spain. But the East was furious. From their point of view, the creed was sacred and finalized by an ecumenical council. No single church had the right to change it on its own. And finally, there was the biggest issue of all: authority. Cardinal Humbert made it clear that he expected the Patriarch to recognize the Pope as the supreme head of the entire Church. The East flatly rejected this. They believed Rome had a primacy of honor, yes, but not absolute power. In their view, the Church was meant to be led by a group of equal patriarchs working together. What was supposed to be a diplomatic mission quickly turned personal. Humbert and Cerularius were both stubborn, proud, and unwilling to back down. Negotiations collapsed. Humbert's excommunication document was harsh, inflammatory, and even inaccurate. He accused the Greeks of removing the Filioque from the creed, when in reality the Greeks were simply using the original version that had never included it in the first place. But theology wasn't the whole story. Behind the scenes, power and pride were doing just as much damage. One of Rome's strongest justifications for its authority came from a document called the Donation of Constantine. This text claimed that Emperor Constantine had handed over political and church authority of the Western Empire to the Bishop of Rome. There was just one problem, and it was a forgery. But for centuries, the papacy believed it was real and used it to argue that the Pope wasn't just another bishop, but the supreme ruler of Christendom, including the East. Meanwhile, the East had its own reasons to push back. When Emperor Constantine moved the imperial capital to Constantinople in 330, the city quickly became the center of Christian thought, culture, and influence. To many in the East, Constantinople was the new Rome, and old Rome was slowly becoming irrelevant. In the Byzantine world, church and state were closely tied together, where the emperor held enormous influence over church affairs and the patriarch often followed imperial policy. In the West, things developed very differently. With civil authority collapsing, the Pope stepped into the vacuum and became the most stable source of leadership. Over time, Rome came to see itself as the one pillar holding a broken world together. For many monks and spiritual teachers of that time, the split was a spiritual battle. In their eyes, the loss of unity wasn't simply human stubbornness at work, but the result of divisions stirred up by dark, demonic forces meant to pull believers away from the true experience of God. In the centuries that followed, Eastern spirituality developed even further through hesychasm. This way of life centered on deep inner stillness, the constant repetition of the Jesus prayer, and the pursuit of theoria. Actually encountering God, not just thinking about Him. Eastern mystics believed faith was something you lived and experienced, not just something you defined with words. Because of this, many Eastern monks looked at Western theology with suspicion. In the West, theology was increasingly shaped by scholasticism and logical systems borrowed from Aristotle. To Eastern eyes, this made God feel distant. They felt the West had turned faith into an intellectual exercise relying too heavily on human reason. For the Eastern mystics, true spiritual life was about healing the nous, the eye of the heart. And some went as far as to say the Western approach wasn't just different, but spiritually dangerous. They believed pride and overconfidence in reason had blinded the West, making it unable to truly see God. In their minds, this blindness was the work of spiritual deception. At first, though, the split of 1054 still didn't feel permanent. In fact, when Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, it was partly done with the hope of helping the Eastern Christians against their enemies. On paper, it looked like a chance for healing and cooperation, but reality turned out very differently. As Latin crusaders poured into the East, old resentments resurfaced. Cultural misunderstandings, arrogance, and greed only widened the gap. And then came the disaster that changed everything. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, Western armies never even made it to Jerusalem. Instead, tangled in political schemes and driven by bitterness, they turned their weapons on Constantinople itself. For 3 horrific days, they looted the greatest Christian capital in the world. Hagia Sophia was ransacked, holy relics were stolen, tombs of emperors were desecrated, the population was brutalized. To make matters worse, the Crusaders installed a Latin emperor and a Latin patriarch, ruling over the Greeks as if they were conquered enemies in their own home. For the East, this was unforgivable. What had once been theological disagreement now turned into deep, lasting hatred. A famous saying emerged from this trauma: better the turban of the Turk than the tiara of the Pope. To many Eastern Christians, Western rule felt worse than foreign conquest. After 1204, reunion became almost impossible. Attempts to mend the split were mostly rejected by the Eastern faithful. They saw these efforts not as sincere spiritual healing, but as political deals made by desperate emperors trying to secure military help from the West. And woven through all of this are painful ironies. One of the strangest is this. When Cardinal Humbert placed the excommunication document on the altar of Hagia Sophia, Pope Leo IX had already been dead for 3 months. Technically speaking, Humbert no longer had any legal authority to act. In strict terms, the excommunication shouldn't have counted at all. Even more surprising, those excommunications were aimed only at specific individuals, not entire churches. And yet, over time, later generations treated them as if they had shattered Christian unity completely. After nearly 1,000 years of silence, something remarkable finally happened. On December 7, 1965, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras I met and did what no one before them had managed to do. They officially lifted the excommunications from 1054. Both sides admitted regret for the harsh words of the past and agreed to erase those sentences of excommunication from the memory of the Church, committing them to oblivion. More than anything, it was a powerful symbolic moment. It was an acknowledgement that the split should never have reached that point, and a shared desire to return to the full communion of faith that had existed during Christianity's first 1,000 years. For the first time in centuries, it felt like healing might actually be possible. But here's where the mystery comes in. If the excommunications were lifted in 1965, why didn't unity return? Over time, many of the old theological arguments have softened. Even the famous Filioque debate is now often seen by modern theologians as 2 different ways of describing the same divine mystery rather than an outright contradiction. Yet one issue still stands like a wall between East and West: papal authority. For the Orthodox Church, the idea that one bishop could hold supreme authority over the entire Church is unacceptable. That divide became even deeper in 1870, when the Catholic Church formally declared the doctrine of papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council. For the East, this was proof that Rome had moved even further away from the shared structure of the early Church. There's also criticism of the 1965 moment itself. Some argue that the 1965 lifting of the anathemas was more a gesture of goodwill than true reconciliation. Other condemnations, like those from the Council of Trent, were never addressed, and the existence of Eastern Catholic churches remains a point of tension. The Great Schism persists not for lack of dialogue, but because East and West have grown into very different visions of church governance. Papal monarchy versus shared leadership among bishops. Unity can't be restored with signatures alone. It requires trust, and that trust was shattered 1,000 years ago. The separation remains a deep spiritual wound, a reminder that once lost, unity is painfully hard to regain. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And now I'll leave you with this question. Do you think the Church will ever truly reunite again?